Great. I'm very pleased to be able to give this presentation to the Seminar on Cognitive Informatics at the University of Quebec in Montreal, especially for a reason that I will tell you in a minute. And my title is that machine consciousness is a metaphor. It is only a metaphor. And I noticed that, at least in the popular and sci-fi literature, it is often claimed that machine consciousness is a real thing. And my good friend Stan Franklin actually is one of the authors of that idea, which I believe is a profound misconception. And Stan is a great friend, and he's a very good scientist, a great topologist, and a very good computer scientist as well, a great pioneer. Nevertheless, he and I disagree on one point, and this is the point on which we disagree. I think that machine consciousness, at best, at the current time, is a metaphor. Sometimes it's a dreadful metaphor, and sometimes it's an interesting metaphor. And I have certainly personally benefited very much from the work of Alan Newell, for example, who built a cognitive architecture. And a cognitive architecture is actually not just a metaphor. The very long, 50-year-long cognitive architecture tradition in psychology, and I guess it was a kind of computer science, and it wandered between disciplines, but the cognitive architecture tradition was very, very important. It was always very empirical, as well as going beyond the strict facts, which is just fine. So my claim is that machine consciousness is a metaphor, and it is only a metaphor, and that at times it is a dreadful metaphor, and there is a reason for that that I would like to go into in a second. Can we have the next slide, please? And the next slide is my dedication to the man I believe was the real pioneer of consciousness science in the 20th century, namely Walter Penfield, who died in 1976, and who was the neurosurgeon on a little bit more than 1,200 conscious epileptic patients with protection against pain and infection, of course, to make it a safe operation, relatively safe operation. And he basically became the first brain mapper, or I should say the first cortex mapper in history in terms of the functioning of cortex. Other maps of cortex have been known as well, of course. Those were mostly cellular maps, or of course gross anatomical maps, but the real functional mapping was done by the Penfield team and later on other surgical teams. And what they did basically was talk to the patient. And prior to that, of course, they had to make sure that the patient was in reasonably good shape, was aware of the immediate surroundings, of the date of the week, and so on, of the day of the week, rather. So these were medically compassionate exploratory surgeries in what he called eloquent adults with life-threatening epilepsy. This was still a risky operation at the time. These days, it is done routinely, although there's still some degree of risk, of course. But we have hundreds of published open brain operations, very often in epileptics, but not limited these days to epileptics, because we now have a whole field of invasive brain surgery, as well as non-invasive methods where we have literally thousands of brain images from fMRI, from high-density EEG, from intracranial EEG, which is a wonderful method, very similar to Penfield's, and from any number of other, what I prefer to call neuroscopes, because they're essentially telescopes that allow us to peer into the brain at right now many different scales, all the way from cellular to gross anatomical and functional networks. And Penfield demonstrated for the first time in history that cortex is the organ of mind. I'm going to take that to be his primary discovery, although he had many, many discoveries based on the first claim that cortex is the organ of mind. The idea that cortex is the organ of mind goes back at least to Hippocrates and to many other medical traditions, of course, besides the Western medical tradition. But Hippocrates made that claim and made it very beautifully in a book that was called On the Sacred Disease. Now, every open brain patient in Penfield's long case series was able to answer questions about their conscious experiences while being stimulated in the relevant regions of cortex. And one of the major discoveries that he made, of course, was the discovery of the so-called homunculi, the S1 body maps of cortex, which are the first regions, literal body maps of the cortex that you can find on either side of the central sulcus. And those were major discoveries. The posterior body maps are sensory, and the anterior body maps or homunculi are motor. And one thing that has been insufficiently emphasized, but which I want to talk about here, is that the sensory, the posterior body maps, when they are touched with an electrode or other stimulus in cortex, you feel touches on your body, conscious touches on your body. But when the corresponding regions of the motor cortex, the motor homunculus, are touched, you do not feel touches. In fact, you have no distinctive conscious feelings, but very often you will have the movement of a hand, for example. And it's that in itself is a very interesting phenomenon, because patients commonly deny being in control of their voluntary movement of their hand, because they attribute the control to the surgeon and not to themselves. That tells us a lot about conscious agency, and that has led to its own research program that is very fascinating. So in any case, the posterior cortex, which is mostly sensory, clearly leads to detailed conscious experiences. The anterior cortex, which is motor and planning and prefrontal decision-making and so on, does not necessarily lead to distinctive, rich conscious experiences. Nevertheless, these are what Stan Franklin and I have called consciously mediated experiences. And your ability to wiggle your finger, for example, is a good example of that. Next slide, please. So I consider Wilder Penfield the founder of consciousness science in the 20th century, which is an enormously important role. And he deserves the credit for that, because after those 1,200 brain surgeries, many of which were published in condensed form, in a book by Penfield and Roberts, I believe in 1957, which is now the textbook for neurosurgeons and neurologists and for the rest of us as well who are interested in the conscious brain. These fundamental discoveries have often been limited to medicine, which is a shame because obviously people in psychology, people in biology, people in computer science, and even people who think they are creating consciousness in machines, although that's an incorrect claim. Nevertheless, there's so much they can learn. The brain, by the way, almost has no appearance in the machine consciousness literature, as far as I know. And that is a mistake because the brain is the, quote, engine of conscious sensation, cognition, and voluntary control. And if you take the engine out of the car, you're left with a hole, basically, which doesn't tell you much about consciousness. Next slide, please. And the next slide shows the annual rate of publications in the biomedical journals, which includes the psychology journals, on the topic of conscious and brain. If you simply type those two words into PubMed, you will get this graph. And what you can see that 1950 is about the low point of the words conscious brain in the standard biomedical literature, which by now has 34 million abstracts. But if you look at 2022, this year, you have 28, it says 100, rather on the left-hand side, it is 28,000 results, 28,656 results. Those are all empirical articles or theoretical articles based on empirical evidence on the conscious brain. So those are not metaphorical articles. Those are standard scientific empirical claims for which there is a wealth of evidence. And so to have a machine metaphor that is based on no science whatsoever, as far as I can tell, is an interesting exercise, but it does not have, let's put it this way, it is always a promising field, and there are always things that we can learn from machine metaphors. But it is scientifically negligible compared to the 28,000 articles that you and I can read at the touch of our fingers in PubMed. So next slide, please. So I'm going to suggest that we can talk about a thing called the Penfield test, which I'm going to define here for our use. The Penfield test involves a directly relevant behavioral and reliable subjective experience evidence that we get routinely when we do a neurological examination or a psychological examination of a human being. And we ask them, do you know what day of the week this is? Do you know where you are located? How do you feel today? Are you willing to sign up for this rather invasive, probably, test of your brain, in which you will be awake and conscious and able to talk to your surgeon, but you will be anesthetized and protected from infection, and also protected from pain, of course. So this people feel quite normal during this operation. And so we need legally informed consent. And that is very important because that means that we're treating the patient as a full citizen, as a full human being who is capable of giving informed consent. If the patient can't do that, of course, we get the nearest relatives and so on. But we treat the patient with great respect as a human being. This is not the same thing that we do to the paranoid patient Parry, for example, who was I don't think Ken Colby, who created it, ever considered it to be conscious because he knew better. But Ken Colby did manage to program in very cleverly what he thought were the fundamental emotional operations of a paranoid patient in the hospital. And of course, there was no question of legal consent because he was not assumed to be, he, meaning Parry, was not assumed to be a conscious human being. Then number three, there's a verifiable brain scan. These days it can be non-invasive, which is very, very good because any kind of invasive surgery, of course, runs danger. And after all, Penfield and colleagues did excise dead tissue that they found in the cortex. That was part of the exploratory surgery. It was an opportunistic way of helping the patient. But then, of course, they were extremely, extremely careful to identify living tissue and never to touch the living tissue in the brain. So after all that, number four, they certainly came to a diagnostic decision consistent with their preoperative examination, and they knew whether the patient was conscious or not. And that's relevant for epileptics because epileptics can lose consciousness when they have an epileptic seizure. So this is entirely relevant. And epileptic seizures, of course, are marked by extremely high amplitude oscillations in the electrical activity of the cortex and also very widespread oscillations. It's a brainstorm when people have a grand mal seizure. There are lesser seizures as well that are really quite common. So the Penfield test, which is a new name that I'm giving to all this because it's useful, it shows reality. It does not show only a metaphor. It tells us about the inner lives of these 1,200 patients. It tells us about their concerns, about their very serious, very often disorder, brain disorder, which is very disconcerting because grand mal seizures can strike at any time. And people can essentially lose control of their bodies, which is extremely embarrassing to them. So they're very much aware of that. And until the 1950s, when these operations were done by Penfield, there were not very many medications that were effective for these days we're in much better shape, but still not, by no means, we do not have the problem of the epilepsies, which is now used in the plural, not the singular. We do not have a solution to it because there are aspects of epilepsy that are quite different from what was suspected at that time. Next slide, please. This is a famous slide, I understand. And notice that all the machine metaphors of consciousness, to the best of my knowledge, would flunk the Penfield test that I covered in my previous slide. You can go back to my previous slide when that becomes available. And we know that, yeah, thank you, Stephen. So these four criteria, actually more than that, but let's call it four criteria. And none of these are even met by this very beautiful young mannequin or young looking mannequin whose name is Sophia, which means wisdom. And Sophia, of course, was the goddess of wisdom in Greece, or one of the goddesses of wisdom. There were more than one. And we know that the gentleman on the left-hand side was plausibly conscious, and that the mannequin on the right-hand side was not conscious by the Penfield criterion. I'm not even going to talk about the so-called Turing test until the next slide. And so I believe that to be true. And of course, during the Q&A, you're welcome to challenge my claims. Next slide, please. So by the Penfield test, we find that the cute little girl on the left-hand side is entirely conscious, as you might expect if you were the mom, for example, and that the robot doll on the right-hand side is not conscious. This corresponds to common sense, but people in the field of machine consciousness have very often transcended common sense and are happy to tell us about that. And this is done. Next slide, please. My regular. Can you fix the? Yeah. The next slide is. Oh, thank you. The next slide is number 8, and this is a friendly critique of the alleged quote Turing quote test, which has 2 fatal defects. Pardon me. And I put it in double quotes because I think both of the names that are used for the quote Turing quote test are incorrect. They are at best metaphors and at worst not even metaphors. First of all, the so-called Turing test was not named or seriously proposed by Alan Turing as an empirical test for conscious brains. Turing was a very great mathematician, as I assume everybody knows. He devised the what is called the Turing machine in the mathematical theory of automata. And the Turing machine was a purely mathematical machine in the sense that it could never exist in plain reality. And the reason why it could not exist in plain reality is because Turing assumed that his mathematical machine would have infinite memory and infinite time to compute whatever function it was going to compute. And since there are no such machines on the Earth, only mathematical machines can have infinite time and infinite memory. The Turing machine was always a mathematical construct, very important mathematical construct, because it led, of course, to the digital computer, and it led to any number of theorems that could be proved from a set of well-defined assumptions. So in my view, he talked about the imitation game, which is a perfectly good label for the so-called Turing test, and I think it's really more honest. I don't think it's really even respectful to Alan Turing to attribute a, quote, test to a great mathematician who thought it was only a game. So somebody stuck that name onto the alleged test. And I hope we will ask for Alan Turing's forgiveness for that. So this is not a test, if by a test we mean an empirical test in the theory of psychometrics or in philosophy of science or any other of the fields that study scientific testing and scientific anchoring of constructs in the observable world. Next slide, please. So what does the alleged Turing test, in quotes, really test? I think, I'm a psychologist by training and experience. So I think it probably measures a guess by the human observers. So it tells us about the audience. It does not tell us about the object that the audience claims to believe something about. And I have a personal experience of that. Because when Ken Colby at UCLA Medical School was constructing Perry, I think Perry was encoded in Fortran, if I remember correctly. Fortran is not a particularly good AI language, but it's very, it can do the job. The Parry simulation was a simulation of the emotional processes in a hypothetical paranoid patient at the UCLA Medical Center. And Ken Colby told his medical students the day before that they were going to have an opportunity to interview a conscious paranoid patient via teletype. So they would not actually see the patient, but they would be able to converse with the patient. And after they heard Ken Colby's blatant lies about that, they were challenged to diagnose the patient and to see if the patient exhibited paranoid features, which was really easy enough because paranoid patients, when they are examined very frequently, especially by a strange doctor who hasn't established a relationship with them, they're suspicious. That's the definition of paranoia. People are dysfunctionally suspicious. And of course, when you start asking them personal questions like, "Hi, how are you?" and "How are you feeling today?" and "Do you like your surroundings?" and "Do you know where you are?" and so on, they will answer maybe 2 or 3 of those questions. Then they will retreat, which is exactly what the very conscious robot did, and that was fairly trivial. And I got a chance to do the teletype thing, and because I knew something about language, I could figure out that Perry was not programmed up to do discourse reference, so it wasn't able to refer to anything outside of the sentences that it came up with, which were just a list of sentences, Q&As. But children can tell you about objects in the world, and later on, when they keep talking about it, and if it's talking about an airplane going on overhead, they can refer to it again using linguistic references, which are built into what has been called the targeting system of language, which is a universal feature of human languages. Well, I knew well enough that Parry wasn't built for that, so I beat Parry in about 3 moves by making use of that obscure linguistic fact. But the thing, of course, is that a real patient, a human being, would easily have demonstrated his linguistic skill or her linguistic skill, because discourse reference is something that we routinely use. It's one of the major features of all languages, all natural languages that we have. So Parry flunked the Turing test from my point of view. However, the medical students who were set up by Ken Colby by his previous lecture, of course, they fell for the gag, which all goes to suggest that what the so-called Turing test tells us is about the audience, not about the object that the audience thinks it is talking about. And we know that from numerous sources, of course, because human beings have been known to believe in conscious play dolls, like the little in conscious choo-choo trains, in sacred rocks, in the sun as a conscious entity. The extremely sophisticated Egyptians believed that. In the earth, which many Gaia worshippers these days believe in, and of course the moon and many other objects in the night sky. Almost all otherworldly beings in the human imagination are believed to be conscious. I believe I only know of one exception to that, which is a Greek god who is said to be not conscious. So the highly intelligent Sumerians had 2,000 divinities who heard their prayers and watched their actions. And these marvelous Sumerians, who had the first real empire in human history, allegedly, believed in their 2,000 divinities, not all 2,000 at the same time, I would hope. But each tribal group presumably had its own group of divinities. And those divinities were certainly considered to be conscious, because if your God isn't conscious of whatever you're doing, that's not a useful God to have. Um, uh, Projecting personification, as it's called in literature, projecting consciousness onto aspects of the world, including other animals and other people and invisible entities and so on, is absolutely routine. It's a human universal. It occurs, as far as the anthropologists tell us, it occurs in all studied cultures. Next slide, please. Yeah, this may be familiar. Now, what kind of audience would judge a beautiful young female mannequin with a wonderful smile and bright eyes to be conscious? Well, by the Penfield test, the gentleman on the left-hand side is conscious, and the apparently stunningly beautiful young lady on the right-hand side is not by the Penfield standards. However, the young lady on the right-hand side, whose alleged name is Sophia, the Greek god of wisdom, is not conscious and therefore incapable of being wise. And then the question is, why is she so popular? Why do thousands and thousands of people on the web really want to believe that Sophia is conscious? And every time there's another improvement on Sophia, every time she moves and smiles more nicely and has her eyes batting at us and so on, all these wonderful things, she apparently gets more votes for consciousness. And I would like you to speculate on what this tells us, not about the doll, which is not conscious, but about the audience, which makes the judgment about her consciousness. And I will leave you with that question. I will not hazard an answer, but just leave it to you. And maybe we could talk about it during the Q&A. And let's see if there's any more slides left. Slide 12 shows that machine consciousness is not an empirically proven proposition by the Penfield test. And by now, of course, Penfield stopped working. He died in 1976, I believe. And his last book, to the best of my knowledge, was 1957, which is a terrific book that is still used routinely as a textbook in medical schools. It's a wonderful book. Since the burden of proof in science rests on the proposer, that is to say, the people who believe that Sophia is conscious, and since we have no evidence to that effect, the burden of proof remains to be met. And the conclusion is that alleged machine consciousness is at best a metaphor. And there's a big question whether it is a useful metaphor, because science is full of dreadful metaphors as well as very, very useful metaphors. Metaphors are important in the history of science. At worst, machine consciousness is simply an assertion without evidence and therefore has no scientific standing at all. And the burden of proof is always on the proposer. And here I want to show a famous face that all of us should be familiar with, the face of Karl Popper, who emphasized in a very important context in the history of physics the important role of falsifiability. Every proposition every empirical proposition in science should be falsifiable because that's the only thing that keeps us in touch with reality. So the alleged, quote, Turing, quote, test is apparently not falsifiable. As Karl Popper pointed out, falsifiability is a crucial, essential criterion for empirical science. The alleged, quote, Turing, quote, test also fails all the Penfield empirical criteria for conscious human beings and their living, waking brains. And that was my starting point, and it is also my conclusion. So, I still have my little girl with the robot doll. And I would like to read this slide and say consciousness is an empirical fact with more than 28,000 peer-reviewed articles in the biomedical literature since the 1950s. I would argue that there are far more than 28,000 because, in fact, consciousness has been scientifically studied since around 1800. And we have this marvelous sensory psychophysics literature. We have a hypnosis literature that is equally important, that also began around 1800. And of course, we have the vitally important neurology literature, including Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which were discovered during the 19th century. And they are clearly about what Aristotle thought were the uniquely human aspects of consciousness, namely the capacity to use language. So those were 19th century discoveries. Everybody should know about them because they're fundamental to the study of consciousness. And I've tried to write textbooks that do cover that somewhat superficially, but we need much more work on the empirical history of consciousness, which certainly goes back to Hippocrates in the 5th century BC in terms of highly significant empirical claims about consciousness and the brain. So the human ethical implications of consciousness, of course, are highly important. And I can only touch on that, but I know you can imagine what those are. Consciousness science is not just a game, although it can be a great deal of fun, and it can be played as a game. But it's not just a game because the notion of dehumanization of conscious beings has been abused in just about every human conflict in the long history of hominins, which is about 200 million years. Wait, am I right about that? No, 2 million years of hominin evolution. During that time, anthropologists tell us that human conflicts typically begin with dehumanizing words and ideas that people fling at each other. This is done by every native indigenous tribe, as far as I understand the anthropological literature. It's also done by sophisticated countries like France and Germany when they dehumanize the enemy. This is routine because, of course, it destroys our empathy and our sympathy for the other side. And that means that if the other side consists of robots or machines or barbarians or mere animals, then it's okay for us to use high explosives on their young men. And that, of course, is a key move psychologically before violent conflict. And it's also practiced, by the way, in gang warfare. So it's very, very human universal, very important. And we really don't want to fool around with that. Next slide, please, if I still have a minute. So no one, I believe, should confuse interesting metaphors with real consciousness, because the implications of that confusion are notoriously dangerous. They have clear ethical consequences, which we can see today in the Ukraine. For just one place on Earth, but in fact, there are many places on Earth where there is a willful confusion between conscious human beings and those who are destined for death. Anthropology tells us that all human conflicts begin with dehumanizing words and ideas, and that is true in Iran, just as it is true in the Ukraine. And if you have been listening to Vladimir Putin lately, apparently he has lost many tens of thousands of young men. And as far as he is concerned, there is no serious loss to Russia. I think that is you can read it in today's news and reflect on the reality of dehumanization of conscious beings. And that's a little bit more serious than I actually intended to be, but it is true. And so that is my last word for now, and we'll have a Q&A later on. Stephen, would you do the honors, please? Oh, shall I read slide 17? Is there time for that? Okay.
Yes, go ahead. You still have a few minutes.
If you look at another 2 minutes, good. Well, there's a very important event that people neglect today, which is the collapse of the consciousness science of the 19th century in 1912, when John Broadus Watson, who was then president of the American Psychological Association, published a paper with the significant words that consciousness is nothing but the soul of theology. I'll repeat that. Consciousness is nothing but the soul of theology. And since Watson and other people like him had decided that the soul of theology was pure mythology, which it is not, it meant that anybody who talked about consciousness from that point onward would actually be punished by the behavioristic professional control group. Behaviorism became the professional manifesto. In fact, Watson called his manifesto of 1912 the behavioristic manifesto, and which essentially ruled out this study of consciousness as such, as consciousness. So people who were interested in studying consciousness in the Jamesian tradition, for example, which was and is a magnificent tradition based on James's famous principles of 1890 and his little textbook, which he published years later. The Jamesian psychology essentially died out because all the young people in the field were indoctrinated in the behavioristic denialism, as Galen Strawson recently called it in the New York Review of Books, in a very important article that I strongly suggest as reading, because Strawson is a very good philosopher who takes this very seriously. In any case, so from 1912 to perhaps the present time, because we still have behavioristic denialism today. There's actually still quite a good deal of it, and people don't realize they are behaviorists when they are behaviorists, because it has so much become part of the furniture of everyday life in the psychobiological sciences. But there is such a thing still. It is, I believe it's unfortunate to the extent that allows us to deny what is plain and obvious to Penfield and anybody else in medicine and psychology or in any other field that deals with real human beings, or for that matter, with real living animals who are also conscious. So these are important matters. They are sometimes very funny, and I enjoy a joke as much as anybody else does. But in this particular case, I'm ending on a rather stentorian note here by referring to the gross abuse and unethical abuse of human nature and animal nature for the last century, much of which can be attributed to John B. Watson, but not just John Watson, because Watson, after all, reflected much of the scientific opinion of his time. That history still remains to be written, unfortunately, but I'm willing to do it if nobody else will do it. And if somebody else would like to do it, please let me know, and we can all work on it together. History is not something that requires only a single person. It is really a group endeavor, and it is much needed at this time. So thank you very kindly for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this.
Thank you, Bernie.